trade talks just keep picking up for the Spurs, and this recent one sends Chris Paul to the Milwaukee Bucks for young, newly drafted guard A.J. Johnson, but a lot of Spurs fans are up in arms about this trade as it just doesn't solve the main problem the Spurs have, and it sends away a veteran guard that could do more good for this team than maybe any single young player could over the next year or two. So we got to dive into all of that coming up on this episode of Spurs Digest. Before we get into the video, guys, I just want to remind you, you guys are doing great. This number used to be at 95%, but still 86% of you who are watching this video are not subscribed. We got daily Spurs content all season long, all the trades, rumors, reports, stuff like that. If you want a home for that on YouTube, this is the spot. So hit the subscribe button down below. It's completely free. You lose out on nothing. But we're going to get straight into the video, and I want to start with this. So this report comes from Jonah Kubicek, or this trade rumor, I should say, and it has San Antonio Spurs could make mid-season trade with the Milwaukee Bucks. If the season goes according to plan for the San Antonio Spurs, they could shop Chris Paul before the trade deadline. And I just want to start by just kind of going into this briefly. So yes, we all know Chris Paul cannot be traded today. That's not something that can happen. Chris Paul just signed with the team this summer. But a lot of people have been looking at the Spurs, and there's a couple of ways this season could go. Now, I'm a firm believer that the Spurs are going to be pushing for a playoff spot. At the very least, a play-in. Victor Wembanyama is going to take a massive leap. I think he's going to be in the MVP conversation. I think a lot of you do too. And in that situation, keeping a guy like Chris Paul around could again be very valuable. A guy who knows what it's like to try and win down the stretch, to be in these ultra-competitive games as the season's coming to a close. But if the Spurs just kind of falter and they don't click this year the way we hope for them to click, there's a world where Chris Paul gets moved on for another asset and you kind of keep going. But let's dive a bit further into this article. And they say from the Milwaukee side, they're in a precarious situation because Lillard and Giannis, Middleton, and Lopez, they're all making over $20 million, and some of them much more than that. Milwaukee doesn't have much in the way of trade capital, but they do have 19-year-old point guard A.J. Johnson. He was considered a reach when he was drafted, but over the summer league, he has actually looked very, very good. So, well, how would this trade look? How would this implicate the Spurs? So here it is. In the ESPN, or I guess it's a different trade machine. It's a trade machine. It sends Pat Connaughton and A.J. Johnson to San Antonio for Chris Paul and Sidi Sissoko. Now, I think what a lot of you are saying right away is, why? Right? Like, the big question is why? Now, look, if the Spurs are in contention, you keep a guy like Chris Paul around, especially if he's proving that he can play solid minutes while contributing at a very reasonable level. There's no reason to do something like this. But again, like, there's always that question of, like, what if he doesn't come back the next year? Chris Paul's at that point in his career where he's going to decline every single year fairly significantly, or at least that's what past histories of different players that are similar to him would seem to suggest. Then again, a lot of players who are as good as he is, even they'd fall off at a younger age than he is now. But I digress. The big thing here is A.J. Johnson, right? And when I'm looking at A.J. Johnson, the big problem I see is, where does he fit? I should go to this. Where does he fit within the depth chart? Because A.J. Johnson is a guard, right? We're going to tackle this from the Bucks side. We'll get into who the Spurs are giving up in a second. But you look at who the Spurs have. You assume you get rid of Chris Paul. And in this world, I would assume that Stephon Castle is taking over that kind of point guard role, or even if not, Tre Jones, right? I guess it's maybe a bit ambitious to say Castle can take over that point guard role by the time the trade deadline rolls around. But even if it's someone like Tre Jones, you still got Jones, you still got Castle, you still have Flynn, I guess it doesn't really matter, but you still have Wesley, and you still have Branham, who is more of a two, but you have so many young guards, and while A.J. Johnson, like I mentioned earlier, is a fast riser, again, considered a reach, but he has really proven himself over the summer, and a lot of Bucks fans are very high on him. Like, where's he even going to get the minutes? Like, yes, he could push these guys to their limit, and having competition is never necessarily a bad thing when you have so many guys you got to beat out to make that roster spot. It can really help elevate your guys to the top level, and I mean, A.J. Johnson's good. He's big, he got an NBA frame, he can penetrate, he gets his own shot, he has a creative layup package, and he actually has good shooting form. While that three-point shot hasn't fully come together in the way that a lot of people have wanted it to quite yet, he shows a lot of promise there. So all in all, like, he has a lot of the tools, he just hasn't been able to put it together, but you started to see it coming over the summer. But again, when you look at the Spurs depth chart, to me, it makes no sense. Like, first of all, again, this is only if the Spurs have a reason to move on from Chris Paul and they really think getting an asset back is worth it for the expiring contract of Chris Paul. Sure. Look, from the Bucks perspective, I can't really talk too much from the Bucks perspective of whether Chris Paul would even fit for them, but my instant reaction is kind of like, yes and no. He's a solid defender still. He's not that bad, but again, he's old, he's getting slower, and the perimeter defense has been one of their weaknesses, especially after moving on from Drew Holiday, who we're now seeing thrive in Boston, of course. It's like, Chris Paul and Dame Lillard can complement each other, but that just introduces a whole lot of issues in the backcourt. But I'm not going to get into that right here. What would happen to San Antonio is that it would just block your guard rotation. But the other big problem is Pat Connaughton. Because Pat Connaughton, it's not just this year. It'd be this year and next year. And again, you're trading for him in this reality at the trade deadline. So you're getting him for the last part of this season, plus all of next season at $9.4 million. And Connaughton, I'm not sold on him either. He has really not, to me, been at that level. I mean, 9.4 is not that much money, all things considered. And I know it's like, you're taking on about the same amount of money you're giving out. But you're accepting a full whole other year of Pat Connaughton. And some people say he's quite a good defender, though you ask some Bucks fans and they'll even say, like, I don't know, like some days he just doesn't pass the eye test. One of the guys, he's very notorious for falling for every single pump fake, which maybe could get fixed in San Antonio or maybe it just wouldn't fly. So there's issues surrounding that on its own. But also the fact the Spurs would be giving up City Sissoko. Like, I don't know. Am I crazy for being a City Sissoko truther? And we can actually go back to the depth chart. Oh, isn't it so nice having all these little things we can go look at? We go back and look at the depth chart, and it's like, City Sissoko has a chance to make this team eventually, right? And be a kind of player. I guess it's not yet, but I'm a truther. I'm a truther in City Sissoko. Maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe I really shouldn't be. But at the same time, like, I don't know. Maybe sometimes you also have to give up on certain, not give up, I shouldn't say, but move on from certain prospects if the return you get is great. Is AJ Johnson maybe more of a high caliber prospect than Sissoko? I think a lot of people would probably argue yes heading into this season. I don't know what you guys think, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down below. But that's ultimately not where this trade comes from all the way, because it is centered around Chris Paul for AJ Johnson. And just when I look at this roster, like, first of all, I just want to talk again. Like, Chris Paul, even in that second part of the season, even if the Spurs are not doing that good, I see the only way they trade him is if genuinely, like, they can get a very solid asset. And I think AJ Johnson is a solid asset, but I think he'd be blocked. I don't think that's the kind of move you go for, right? If you really want to be competitive for the next couple of years, you maybe try and get maybe more of a wing. Like, you got Harrison Barnes. I mean, like, the Spurs are pretty deep in a lot of positions, but I think point guard especially is not a position that you necessarily want to get a guy at if he's just going to be blocked in, especially, again, if you have guys like, I know Tre Jones is kind of not really a prospect, but you still have guys like Castle, you still have guys like Wesley who really could take a leap this year. I don't know, maybe I have too much faith in every single Spurs prospect, but I don't know. All the same, I don't even see a world, like, I see a world where Chris Paul gets traded, but I'm of the mind that the Spurs are going to be competing right until the last day of the season, and I want to hear what you guys have to say down below. If it comes to the point where you could get a decent return on Chris Paul at the deadline, and you have the chance to get a guy, even if it's not AJ Johnson, but someone of the caliber of that player, because let's be honest, this is just one trade, but there's going to be a lot of trades similar to this kind of propping up as the season goes on, especially, you're going to see fluctuations in the win-loss record, and you're going to see people talking about trades for, Keldon Johnson or Chris Paul, or even you're probably going to start seeing Devin Vassell trade rumors pop up all over the place if the Spurs start losing some games, right? So if we're talking the most realistic target, Chris Paul makes a lot of sense. He's on a one-year contract at the deadline. He's going to be in high demand. He's a veteran point guard, a ton of leadership, can still play at the NBA level, and he'll get another chance to prove that this year. So if you're to trade him at the deadline, would you trade him for a player of the caliber of AJ Johnson? Would you want someone maybe a little more established? Or would you prefer something like a pick for the future? Maybe a future first-round pick from a team, if that's what he ends up fetching, which he very well could, that the Spurs could use on a player they choose. I'd love to hear from you down below, because I think this is open for a ton of discussion. But for now, that'll do it for this episode of Spurs Digest. If you enjoyed, leave a like, comment, and guys, subscribe to the channel. We got Spurs content all season long. Myself, Keenan, Brian, we're going to be keeping you up to date with all the latest news, rumors, reports, all that stuff. So if you want a new home for that, this is your spot. Click the button down below. I've been your host, Josh Gosse. I'll catch you in the next one.